Thank you so much, Ajit, for that amazing introduction. And first of all, I would like to start with thanking each and every one of you, because it's a commitment to be here in person. So I'm honored. I know that the team at Sampoorna Ahara is deeply honored as well. And we hope that the time that you spend with us this evening is going to be insightful, it's going to be informative, and most importantly, if it's provocative and has you thinking about our own sovereignty when it comes to colonialism, nutrition, the impact that it may have had on our epigenetics. And I'm using a lot of these terms. I will endeavor to describe some of these terms as we go along during the session. But should you have any questions in terms of certain things that I've mentioned, if there's observations, I know that some of you are experts in your own fields in terms of water management or grey water harvesting. Vermiculture and composting is what I heard about you, Vani. So all of these things are dots that we ought to connect, because it's part of the ecosystem that we as a culture, irrespective of which corner of this country that you belong to, it was part of our ecosystem. And we've forgotten that those dots were connected at one point in time, and it's important that we reconnect them. So I'm not going to be sharing anything awfully new. It's just insightful, and hopefully it will make intuitive sense. Yeah? All right, so we're going to start with a meditation. And I encourage you to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing that. And if not, it's fine. You can look at the screen and what's happening there. As you close your eyes, breathe your eyes closed. Take a deep breath in, and on a count of 3, release that breath. Bring your attention back from all the places, people, points in time, situations that you may be thinking about. Your presence today is most valuable. We're going to dedicate this meditation to our ancestors. For you to be born today and to be present physically in this location, all of us, with all the souls that are present, whether they are visible in the physical plane or they are invisible at a spiritual plane, for all the souls to be present, for you to be born, you needed to have biologically 2 parents. And you needed 4 grandparents. If you knew them, if you had the honor of knowing each of them, think of them being here physically. You needed 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, 32 third great-grandparents, 64 fourth great-grandparents, 128 fifth great-grandparents, 256 sixth great-grandparents, 512 seventh great-grandparents, 1024 eighth great-grandparents, and 2048 ninth great-grandparents. Over the last 400 years, 4 centuries of time, 4,094 ancestors, their lives, their souls, their work came together, intersected for you to be here today. we offer our gratitude. And as we offer our gratitude to those ancestors, we also bring to this space a sense of curiosity and a sense of wonder as to how our ancestors used to live, how they ate, what they dressed with, what were the conversations that they were having on a daily basis. Did they have any chronic illnesses? If they did, how did they remedy them? So let's bring that sense of wonder. I encourage you to breathe your eyes back open as we start this conversation together. As you reflect, I would like to offer another food for thought. While we inherit our earthly values from our ancestors, we borrow the earth itself from our children. And in having borrowed the earth and the biome, the land, the soil, the ozone, the air, the atmosphere, everything, the plants, the fauna, in having borrowed that richness and that wealth, what we do with it today is going to determine what will happen to humankind, especially our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and whether they'll be still alive on planet Earth for them to remember us and offer a gratitude ancestral meditation. Because we might be part of those 4,094 souls who would make it happen for them, to congregate. At the rate at which we're going, by the way, humankind probably won't survive, but it totally depends on us. So let's make this moment count. What I'm hoping today is that we will connect the following dots, what you see on your screen. We'll look at a revered animal. This is the land of Nandi the bull. Yesterday I spent some time in Nandi Hills, and there was a lot of references, a lot of symbolism around cows and bulls, and as we know in our tradition, there is a great significance and symbolic meaning offered to that animal. We're going to talk about the cow. We'll also talk about cuisine. And when I say cuisine, it's just a fancy English word for food and culture. When you mix it together, a really nuanced term like cuisine is born. And we look at colonialism, and I think that this conversation is, pretty rife, and it's pretty apt, given that Queen Elizabeth II just passed away. And there's a lot of conversation in the subcontinent, as well as in, parts of the Indian diaspora and other non-Indian, communities, about what does the monarchy stand for? What has the crown stood for? The type of past and the present and the future that they stand for, and what is the impact that they may have had, either by design or unwittingly, on communities that they colonized. And obviously we're one of those. Our ancestors were part of that colonization, so we'll talk about that. And as Achutin mentioned about chronic illness, I met with a mutual colleague of ours who's written a book. Her name is Dr. Maitri Shankar, and I had breakfast with her this morning. I will show you the book that she's written as well. And we were thinking and we were discussing how chronic illness, people say, oh, it's normal. If you hit 40, I'm going to turn 42 in a couple of months. And people say, well, it's normal to have diabetes. It's part of the aging process. There's a lot of vocabulary that we hear more and more, that it's part of the aging process. People get cancer, it's normal. And Maitri and I, we were thinking about how it's normalized, but it's not normal. And there's a difference. So if it's normalized to be obese, then it's still not a condition that is normal for a human being. We'll talk about that. And within that chronic illness, we will also talk about genetics and epigenetics. And we'll create a distinction between genetics and epigenetics, things that we cannot control and things that are a blend of nature and nurture, and parts of that which we hopefully can control. And finally, we'll talk about climate. We'll talk about the climate burden of colonialism that we've inherited, the climate burden of the lifestyles that we're unfortunately following at this point in time. Before I go further, just because we have such an amazing, rich, multilinguistic heritage, and I speak a few different languages, I just want to know, just by show of hands, people who understand English, the language of the colonizer. So most of us. People who understand Hindi. All right. I'm not going to ask about Punjabi. I'm pretty fluent in that too. But so if I lapse into Hindi just to make a certain point, and I apologize, I'm not fluent in Kannada at all, you know. So if I lapse into Hindi just to make a point, I hope that's comfortable with the audience. All right, I see heads nodding. Thank you so much for giving me that liberty. All right. Our first chapter, or the mini bite, is around the divine bovine. Bovine is the word for the species of what we call cattle, you know. And cattle, again, it's a word that, you know, a lot of food justice advocates cringe away from because it's like livestock. You know, it's such a material word, cattle and capital and livestock. So we'll just say it's the divine bovine. We'll refer to it as the species is referred to by human beings. And we'll ponder together about a few questions. When did the cow and bull enter the lives of ancient Indians? What was the need for this relationship that we happen to develop with this species? What unique symbolism did it acquire for our culture? And how has this relationship impacted or interacted with our genetics? I mean, obviously you guys are aware of the COVID-19 pandemic that wreaked a lot of havoc in the world, and especially in our country. When viruses skip from one species and come into another species, they tend to, you know, create a big hue and cry. We all experienced it. So we'll also learn if there was some interaction that's going on between genetics and of human beings and the divine bovine. What you see on the screen, or what you should have seen on the screen, is the map of India. It's the Indian subcontinent. And I think with how it's a scatter diagram, so with the dots you can actually see the little outline of the Indian subcontinent. We're all pretty familiar with the map. So when you look at it, this actually shows you the footprint of when the cows or you know, the bovine animals were actually domesticated for the first time in the Indian subcontinent. When we look for reference, around 10,000 years ago, years before present, and I want to stay away from BC and AD because it's before Christ and Anno Domini and all of that. Again, you'll notice it's vocabulary we've inherited from the colonizer. Our calendars run differently. The Hindu calendar runs very differently. The Mayan and Aztec calendars run very differently. When we say AD and BC, obviously we're referring to the Gregorian calendar. And it sort of sets a yardstick that the world began after Christ, or this was the world before Christ. But we're a land of an ancient civilization. We're living in the shadow of these beautiful temples that were there even before you know, a lot of so-called civilization happened. So 10,000 years before present, why BP? That's the term that archaeologists use. It's a secular term, specifically in areas of Scandinavia. So we're looking at Norway, Sweden, a lot of the northern Europe is when it happened for the first time. What you see here, if you can see, there's a green, a darker green kind of a patch. That's the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, modern day Pakistan, some parts of Punjab and so on. That is exactly where around 7,000 years ago, the bovine animal started to be domesticated. And by the time this domestication wave came down to where we are at this point in time, it was somewhere between 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. When you look at it from a geological time scale standpoint, it's a blink of an eye. It's actually shorter than a blink of an eye, right? So our history, our relationship, our love affair with the cows and the bulls is fairly new. And when we look at what it was, what did that animal look like for the first time when early ancient Indians would have actually seen it in the wild? It looked somewhat like what you see, this humped bull. And it's called, it's nomadicus, it's Bos indicus nomadicus, that's the Latin term for it. So Bos indicus was a specific breed or subspecies of the cow that was domesticated in our part of the world. And we'll see how it differs from the animal that was domesticated in Europe. That was called Bos taurus. So you will see that on your screen. The Bos taurus was adapted to colder weather because Europe is in a higher latitude, because our Earth is spherical. And it still does, has an early onset of puberty. And puberty is when a cow can get pregnant, right? Because, I just want to ensure that we have a level playing field here. Because sometimes when I speak, a lot of people don't realize cows don't give milk. Pregnant cows give milk. And that's a really important distinction for us to make. Sometimes there are individuals in the audience who don't readily make that distinction, but once I say it, it becomes more present. So puberty is a really important thing. And once we started domesticating the cow, it was important for early, our ancestors, either here or in Europe, for them to figure out the fertility season of the cows. And it turns out that the Bos taurus has a very predictable fertility season. And my conjecture, my hypothesis is that because they have a short season and they have a lot of snow and so on, probably the breeding season or the fertility window for the cows, the Bos taurus, might have been really, really constricted, might have been limited. On our side, with Bos indicus, that cow, the original cow, has very deeply unreliable fertility window. So for her to get impregnated naturally with a bull, it's unpredictable. And when humans want to do it by design, they have to really manipulate the Bos indicus. And we'll see how that manipulation has happened at this point in time. When we look at the Bos taurus, higher fertility rates, higher yields of both milk and meat. And when we look at the Bos indicus, you'll see how different both these animals are, right? Humped back, loose skin around the neck, tropical disease resistant, hardy, adapted to hot and humid tropical weather, delayed onset of puberty, lower fertility rates. So we cannot expect it to yield lots and lots of milk. Unreliable reproductive patterns and poor yields of milk, I've already mentioned that. So we've established that there was a difference, a subtle difference, perhaps not so subtle, quite a big difference in the two different types of bovines that were domesticated by human beings, difference between European and ours, the Indian subcontinent. So obviously the next question is, did ancient Indians process dairy? And this is not just a question I've asked, this is a question that a lot of archaeopaleontologists, archaeobotanists, these sorts of people, experts, scholars, they've wanted to know. And I think that in part, a lot of them have been motivated by folklore, because we have a lot of folklore around how in ancient India there was, a plethora, huge, vast amounts of dairy being consumed, and we'll come to the hero of Hindu mythology and historical figure, a really charming, divine figure that we have in the Hindu pantheon. And obviously there's a lot of fable, a lot of folklore, a lot of mythology associated with, you know who I'm talking about, it's Lord Krishna, of course. So we'll talk about him. But these archaeologists, and this wasn't too long ago, this study happened in 2020, and then another set of archaeologists repeated it in 2021. And what they did was, they went to ancient North India, the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley sites, and they started looking at potsherds, so cookware, and they started doing this compound isotope, analysis, which is like latest technique and technology, I'm told. I chanced upon these two research papers, and it was pretty interesting that they found very low fat concentrations in majority of the samples. And where they did find the fat concentrations, most of them were adipose tissue, which means that maybe the flesh had been cooked and then it was there. They didn't find, contrary to what they were hoping to find, they didn't find a lot of dairy fat residue. And the values are here, the values of 5 of the 53 samples, and that's less than 10%, indicated the presence of dairy fat. And in the same time period, the archaeological evidence also indicated that ancient Indians actually had a preference for a high fiber, plant predominant diet. And the reason a lot of these archaeological studies haven't been published or haven't come forth, or they're not as known, is because macrobotanical evidence of plant residues, they don't survive. Fat survives. It sticks to ancient cookware and it's easier to determine. But now they have lots and lots of ways, lots of genetic technology and so on, to be able to look under a microscope and see whether a trace belongs to a plant oil or a plant fiber or a grain, or it belongs to flesh. Yeah? And the one thing that they actually found was 10 different types of millets. They didn't find too much of rice or modern cultivars of rice or wheat. They found lots and lots of millets. Now when we look at specifically South India, and I wanted to bring some information if it was available, and I'm very fortunate to find some about ancient Karnataka. The menu seems to be predominantly plant-based. I didn't find any reference to milk payasam. If you guys happen to find any research paper that says that ancient people in Karnataka region had milk payasam, or those sort, and lots of ghee, please let me know. I couldn't find it. What they did was they did something called macro lump analysis, and I don't know if I have some of these. No, I don't have the slides that were in that research paper. If you're interested, I can share that with you. This is Iron Age Karnataka, and they found lots of millet bread and pulse dough. They didn't find dairy fat. They didn't find ghee. They didn't find any of that. And it remains significantly understudied because a lot of this technology it's an issue of access to our archaeologists, to our paleontologists and so on. So a lot of these studies are happening where Indian teams might actually be led, and if they're in an overseas university and they have access to grants and so on, so they end up being very curious about where they come from, and that's how we're developing archaeobotanical research. So the lump analysis was pretty interesting. The other thing that was really interesting was, and here I'm going to share with you a bias that I've carried. As a North Indian person, as a Punjabi, a lot of times we'd be like, South Indians have rice, North Indians have wheat. We eat chapatis, you guys have rice. There's lots and lots of bias, uninformed, ignorant bias that's prevalent. It's part of popular perception. The reality is, irrigated rice cultivation did not begin in South Asia until extremely recently. like as early as the British times, as recently as British times. And the reason for that was that this irrigated rice it's technically called Oriza or Oriza sativa. It's predominantly from the Chinese region. And we had our own type of rice, wild rice, red rice, black rice, different types of rice. And there was this one specific one, which apparently is really good, and it's so suited for the Karnataka climate. It's called Oriza nivara. And it's blast resistant, rot resistant, sheath blight resistant, drought resistant, all of those things. And unfortunately, old grains are very difficult to come by. And right now, lots and lots of people are trying to preserve, wherever they can find these ancient grains and ancient seeds from. Again, availability of, I'm just going to sort of look through this list of what do you need for payasam, and I'm just using that as a placeholder recipe here, So when we think of payasam or kheer in North India, we're thinking of, it needs to have rice, it needs to have sugar, it needs to have milk. And, we're all pretty curious, we're smart people, so we start to have access to any of these ingredients. If they had no access to even one of the ingredients, then the payasam recipe of today wouldn't be possible, right? So when we look at rice, no irrigated rice cultivation happened here. Oriza nivara was present. Availability of cow milk, we've already discussed how the Bos indicus was completely unreliable when it came to yields, milk yields, dairy yields. Access to ghee, again, we know that there's a caste system, there's a class system that was followed. When we look at some of the recipes at this point that tend to contain ghee, they tend to be pretty royal sorts of recipes, Mysore pak, like it has to have ghee in it. The access to ghee, which is like this tiny processed drop from already limited finite amounts of milk that ancient Indians might have had access to, who's going to get the lion's share first? It's not going to be the person on the street. It's going to be the person who's the feudal lord, who's the chieftain, who's the Raja, who's the Maharaja, the emperors, and so on. So let's assume that access to ghee was not widespread. And when we look at refined white sugar, this is a jaggery predominant geography. We never processed white table sugar. We never sieved it with bone jar. That's not something, that's not native technology, neither to South India nor to North India. So if we didn't have white sugar, we didn't have flowing access to ghee, if we didn't have lots and lots of cow's milk available, if we didn't have the kind of white, polished, bleached, fiberless, mulchy rice, then it's food for thought that the current recipe of payasam is not an ancient recipe of payasam or kheer, depending on wherever you're from. The other thing is, when we look at the Karnataka cuisine, specifically from this region, it has amazing plant-based diversity, like nowhere else in India. Like honestly, I compare Punjabi cuisine to what Google showed up for me, and I look at sprouts. I mean, Punjabis don't think about it. Fermentation of lentils, Punjabis don't think about it. In ancient South India, in ancient Karnataka, there was a tradition of utilizing grains, lentils, legumes in a certain form or fashion which was endemically, seasonally, regionally, epigenetically appropriate for early, ancient and medieval and indeed modern South Indians, and I would extend it to say for human beings. So when we look at it, again, the state has multiple cuisines. I don't need to preach to the choir, you know this better than I do, North and South Karnataka cuisine. In fact, I was sharing with Achyutan when I was putting this slide together, I learned so much about a part of my own country. Just by having this opportunity to talk to you guys, I probably wouldn't have gone in and looked at so many different cuisine, the multi-ethnic cuisine and the diversity here. And I'm pretty sure you guys have heard about the folklore about the king and how Bangalore got its name. It's the story of the beans, right? So if it's the village of boiled beans, and right now we're focusing on peri-peri flavored, spicy KFC fried chicken, and with billboards everywhere around. There's got to be some sort of a mismatch. And then we also look at non-pescatarian, ceremonial, animal-based inclusions that primarily happened when there were transplants from migration. So there's a lot of Arabic migration. This is coastal area. Access to the Arabian civilization was pretty high. There were trade links between people in ancient South India and so on. There's a lot of migration. There's Muslim rule, of course. There's pre-British colonial forays that happened. So I've just listed a few. I hope I got the transliteration in English right about the kori sukka and Mysore mutton chops and all of these pork dishes, or even benne dosa. Somebody told me, oh, you're going to Karnataka, you should have benne dosa. Obviously they didn't realize I don't do butter. So I looked it up, and the history of that type of a dosa is like 1928 or 1930s. So if anyone tries to tell, a visitor that benne dosa is what people in Karnataka eat and that's traditional cuisine, I mean, that's deplorable. But we know that there's a lot of media attention, there's a lot of branding, there's a lot of, popular perception that happens that way. There was a July 2022, I just took a little reference here at the bottom of the slide. There's a mitochondrial DNA study of the Kurgi people that was done. And there's been a long-standing debate of, where do their different colored eyes and, different cultural customs, etc., come from. And so this study, and as recently as July 2022, actually confirmed that there's presence of Eurasian blood in the Kurgi people. So probably Alexander and a couple of his, generals did settle in and they intermixed. And when that happens, it brings a lot of cultural diversity to cuisine as well. So we see that presence in the Kurgis. When we look at ancient medieval Karnataka, role of ghee in animals, this is pretty similar, when you look at all of South Asia. Religion and royalty are the two main motivational drivers when it comes to inclusions of animal-based, animal-processed materials or ingredients in food. One, because technology and supply chain were extremely restricted back in the day. You didn't have large-scale dairy farms, you didn't have factories and so on processing all of these things. The only people who had access to technology of any sort were either the priests, who were patronized by the kings, or the royal kitchen, right? The kings themselves. So cows and oxen were important for the transition that was needed to the agricultural settled society. That's the reason why both cows and oxen assumed a really religious, traditional, symbolic sort of a, halo around themselves. The specific thing that happened though in South Asia was a religious and royal injunction against the consumption of beef. Now the reason, again, I'm conjecturing, we're joining these dots, and we don't. Why that may have happened is because if the cow's fertility patterns are so unreliable, the production or the birth of oxen to cultivate is that much more limited. And that is not the case for Bos Taurus in Europe. They also had access to horses. Horses are not native to South Asia. So a lot of the times the plow was actually being driven not by cattle in Europe, but horses were being used. So we didn't have the horse. And our cows were pretty unreliable in terms of producing male offspring. So, a bunch of really influential people in medieval, ancient India got together and they said, no beef consumption. Ghee was a key Ayurvedic pharmaceutical substance. So again, I was sort of looking through some of our ancient textbooks. I read a little bit of Sanskrit, and I also got in touch with a plant-based Ayurvedic practitioner, just trying to understand, their perspective on ghee. And one of the things that I found it really interesting, well, two things. They said anupan. So anu is atom, and back in the day, if you didn't have certain types of technology to be able to get, metallic or metal things, or like resinous ingredients in pharmaceuticals, you needed some sort of a fat to carry it as a carrier to be able to deliver it to your cells. So it was important, apparently, for ghee to play that role. So ghee in and of itself wasn't the remedy, it was the carrier of the remedy. And the second thing that she told me was about ama. Ama is the word for toxic inflammation. So even if ghee was used as an anupan in certain very specific Ayurvedic formulations, it wasn't meant for everyone. People who had toxic inflammation, ghee was actually contraindicated. So in ancient, India, when we look at some of the medicinal, books and those sorts of treatises, we actually see that there are at least 20 types of prameha that are mentioned, urinary diseases. And then there are 2 types of madhumeha that are mentioned. Madhumeha is the word for diabetes. And not surprisingly, you have diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2. So ancient Ayurvedic Indian practitioners were aware of these 2 different types of diabetes even back then. And they had some really interesting things, and we know that the remedy didn't include ghee, because obviously somebody who has diabetes, which used to be called disease of affluence. Kings used to have the pot belly. You see one of the guys, on the screen, he's got a pot belly, he's got a lot of truncal adiposity, and that obviously, is a big sign of high BMI, right? Cardiovascular disease potentially. He's the perfect poster child from medieval in India. I think he's the guy who wrote Manasolasa. Have you heard of this book, Manasolasa? And it's apparently one of the oldest royal culinary reference in the world, and it speaks of inclusion of ghee befitting for kings. So if you're a king, you're going to have ghee, and if you're pot-bellied, then maybe it's a sign of, and I'm going to lapse into Hindi here, because, well, at least in Punjab or in North India, they say, agar ladka mota hai to khate peete ghar ka hoga, right? So khata pita ghar means that they have lots and lots of ghee, they have lots and lots of, access to milk and so on. And if he is rotund here, he will be able to look after the girl once, she marries into the family. So that is how the divine liquid gold, that is ghee, it started percolating from religion to royalty to an aspirational ingredient for people who, aspired to have a higher socioeconomic status. I'm going to start talking about Lord Krishna. So he's one of my favorite people in the Hindu pantheon. In the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 17, from verses 4 to 10, I believe, he actually, in a really eloquent sort of a way, explains different modes of being. The mode of darkness, the mode of goodness. And he talks about sattvic, which is basically, if you're in the search for truth, what is it that you should be consuming, not just from a nutritional standpoint, but also from a spiritual thinking standpoint. So there's food for thought, and then there's food for your body. And he talks about the sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic guna qualities. And what I've attempted over there is almost like a modern day pyramid, where you see most of the unctuous, really moist, wholesome prana shakti containing fruits, vegetables, legumes, lentils to be a part of that entire group. When you look at rajasic, again, the word is from royalty, right? From Raja. Because the guy has to go defend. He has to go, he's a warrior. So things that can actually create, that are stimulants. So a lot of things like peppers, chili peppers. And we know that Jainism is they're a community that are actually still carrying forward that way of eating. Sometimes they're not going to have garlic, and they won't have onion, and so on. They also talk about stimulants, like beverage stimulants. So alcohol or caffeine, caffeinated beverages will also be part of it. Lord Krishna had no idea about caffeine, by the way. There was no caffeine in India at that point in time. We'll have a look at how the chai and the coffee happened. But I can say this with 100% surety that Lord Krishna was not imbibing filter coffee, and he was not imbibing a lot of chai in the morning. If he was alive and if he's still around us, he would probably put it in the Rajasic or the Tamasic segment either. When you look at Tamasic, it's pretty obvious. You've got violent foods or violent products that are obtained through violence. When you kill a fish, it has been murdered and then somebody has fried it and put it on our plate. That slaughter is violence, so you're consuming violence. When you look at it scientifically, animal-based products, and I think Achutan is the right person to get into the clinical details of it, but there's a specific compound, it's a metabolite that's produced in our gut. It's called TMAO whenever we consume an animal-based product. And what it does is it actually completely compromises the gut bacteria. It creates a lot of inflammation, and it sets the foundation for presence and seeding of chronic illness like cancer, diabetes, and so on. They're basically foodborne diseases. And again, when we look at the Shakahari approach, Shak is vegetables, Ahar, Sampurna Ahar, right? Ahar is meals or nutrition or food. I mean, this is not lacto-vegetarianism. It's vegetarianism. And I know that there's this emergence of a word, again, colonized word, veganism. British Vegetarian Society came up with in 1942. When I think of veganism, I think it's a really fancy Western sort of a term. But when we look at our own culture, our own history, actual 100% vegetarianism is Shakahari, and there is no room for any kind of an animal-based product in it. That is a latter inclusion. It's a latter time inclusion, and it really begs us to think and be curious about how did that happen? I might be lying, our genes are not going to lie. So I needed to bring up this slide. This was a really interesting research that happened in University of Chicago School of Medicine, and first of its kind, and I hope not the last, because we deserve to look into this way more. 2,284 individuals, that's a really large sample size, from 106 populations. They had different tribes, they had different gotras, they had different sub-gotras, they had different castes, all represented. Because of the caste system in India, reproductive isolation occurred. What is reproductive isolation? Is people marry using kinship and caste-based rules. You can marry someone, you cannot marry somebody else. And what that means is certain types of genetic material will be replicated or spread far and wide and lead to genetic drift in populations, and certain types of behavioral traits or genetic traits will actually just stay secluded in certain places. So what this study actually found was 4 out of 5 South Asians cannot metabolize dairy. So that's established genetically. When you look at the drift of that ability to be able to metabolize dairy, you see when you go southward and when you go eastward, it reduces even further. And when you look at some of the hot spots in the northwestern part, that doesn't mean that, oh, now Navisa Punjabi, she should have lots and lots of milk, I have the carte blanche, I can, metabolize dairy. No, that's not true. I cannot. Nobody can, not even Europeans can. It's a very rare genetic mutation that happens. What you're looking at right now is certain castes, cow herding castes, that have a limited but more extended ability to tolerate lactose. And doesn't mean that they won't have repercussions if they were to consume lactose in copious amounts, which unfortunately they do. And you see the same thing in ancient South Indian cow herders. So there were a couple of tribes and castes from South Asia, South India, that were picked up in this study, and there were a couple of North Indian cow herding castes that they picked up. So I'll give you an example of the Yadava clan. So Lord Krishna was a Yadav, the Yadu clan, the Yaduvanshi clan, they were cow herders, they were pastoralists. When you look at their ability to metabolize lactose, it's slightly more as compared to others. And that is exactly, it's just such a blessing, you know, when geneticists and epidemiologists do this sort of research. It's a blessing in disguise that India had the caste system, because reproductive isolation just kept that ability to tolerate lactose just within a certain caste. If we didn't have the caste system, probably that would have created greater drift because of intermarriage. So this is an interesting food for thought. So now we move into some of the interesting, you know, elements like coffee and tea. When did the cow and other animals enter the mainstream kitchens of Karnataka? Or what were the new dynamics of this relationship? What unique symbolism did it acquire for our culture? And how about caffeine? So when we look at it, and I've mentioned this before, there's a lot of Indo-Portuguese, Indo-European influence, Indo-Persian, and before the Mughal Empire dominated most of South Asia, there was also Indo-Arabic and the Sultanate system. And of course, Karnataka state was even called Mysore state, you know, not long ago. And this is well after, like, 20 years after independence. I think it was 1973, wasn't it, right? When the term Karnataka was actually adopted as an official label. So when you look at it, the Arabic, Greek, Portuguese, the Mughal menus, especially the Mughal menu, they offer not just a transcultural inclusion of certain ingredients in the South Asian cuisine, but they also offer, for the first time ever, a vocabulary of power. There's a vocabulary of, you know, class, hierarchy that is automatically created. A lot of these, and I'll give you some North Indian examples. Shahi paneer, you've heard of these terms, right? Shahi paneer and, you know, all of mutton do pyaza, all of these things, even biryani, which is like Hyderabadi biryani, Mysore biryani, different Lucknowi biryani. A lot of these are influences, both the inclusion of certain ingredients, but also certain modes of cooking, like using a clay oven, tandoor. It's a migratory inclusion. Dum. When you give dum to something and you use, you know, this dough and you line it up and cover it and you cook it, cook biryani the right way. And who prescribes the right way? It's not the peasant. It's not the poet. It's the king. It's the court kitchen that controls it. So what happens is, and I'm going to quickly move over, I'll just mention one thing. When we look at ancient India and when we look at cow, right, we've been talking about the cow and we think of ghee, it's a really functional, it plays a really functional role. It's a functional ingredient. It's used by exception, not by the rule. When we start looking at domination of certain political, you know, circles, and when they start adopting cow-based, you know, or dairy-based ingredients, they actually change it from a stoic ingredient to an Epicurean ingredient. It becomes, you know, a lot of, there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus on the richness of it. So it goes from apparently the sattvic situation to a rajasic. And when you look at rajasic, it's the language of power, royalty, luxury, rich food, very heavy. I'm just going to include one slide on coffee. I actually used to work for a really large packaged goods company, and for long years in Brookfields, they used to have their foods and beverages business. So I was looking after the tea and tea-based beverages business, and I'm not going to necessarily get into brand names, but their tea and their coffee it continues to be really popular. It's a chicory blend, in South India. And in North India, it's a different formulation that is sold. It's 100% coffee, Arabica or Rustica blend. And coffee, as you guys know, you're right in the vicinity of where a certain Sufi saint who's much revered brought, he hid some beans and he brought them here, and then finally the estates grew and so on. But it's linked to the Sufi movement, and it's linked to it being a devotional aid, an ingredient that would actually create certain changes in your brain at that point in time, and assist in meditation or in singing and chanting and so on. So it was a functional, ritualistic, devotional ingredient at best, for a saint to be interested in that ingredient. And it wasn't necessarily a daily dose of filter coffee, a daily dose of caffeine. So I just wanted to include that. Here's a really interesting pyramid, and this actually shows in ancient to medieval, to a large extent in modern South Asia, how the dynamics of power and access and affordability are constructed. Obviously, this pyramid is the caste system, and when you look at the new Mughal aristocracy, or when you look at some of the Indo-European influences, they actually came and sat right on top of our pyramid. And they might have been somewhat dairy tolerant. So you now see that it offers a socio-economic framework, and there's increasingly greater and greater aspiration for inclusion of animal-based ingredients. So if I, Nivi, want to tell everyone in society that I've arrived in life, I'm going to throw a party and I'll have butter chicken, and I'll have ghee everywhere, and ghee on khichdi, and I'll do all of those things. So food offers language to prove to our peers and society, we've arrived in life. Now we are like the ruling class. And it continues to happen. It has an impact on cuisine. Also interestingly, when you look at Varnashrama Dharma, which is the Sanskrit word for the caste system, or the division of labor way back when, it has a color component to it, because Varna is the word for color. And when you look at the history of colorism, and when you have the advent of certain races or ethnic groups that tend to have fairer complexions, they're less melanated, and they come and sit right on top of the socio-economic political hierarchy, it also subliminally creates this system of, if somebody is fair, and if somebody has access to a lot of animal-based ingredients, somebody has access to a lot of ghee, must be a rich person. So that's an aspiration that is worth having. Hence, a very popular brand of fairness cream that I also had the misfortune of selling at some point in time in my life. So when we look at what did the British do? They were pretty smart, they had no intentions of staying and getting genetically absorbed in India. The big difference is when you look at the Portuguese, when you look at the Mughals, when you look at people of Arabic origin, when you look at Alexander's people, they genetically intermixed, they married the locals, they became part and parcel of the genetic fabric of our culture. The British had no such intention. They basically showed up here as a trading company. That was the East India Company. And we know that wherever the traders were, military followed, missionaries followed. So there was a lot and lots of inclusions that started happening which were top down. It was almost like, I'm going to stay away and create a power distance from you. I'm going to stay away, create a genetic distance from you. But I'm here to tell you what's the right way to live, what's the right way to think, and more importantly, what's the right thing to eat. And we'll see in the following slides pretty quickly how that happened. Again, in a snapshot, the British, they're Northern Europeans, they're definitely more lactose tolerant as compared to our native indigenous populations. So once again, there's a greater reinforcement and establishment of that power, hierarchy, supremacy, aspirational aspect, access and affordability. And the big thing that it actually created, more than even the ones who came here before and were the political rulers of different parts of South Asia, the British gave a pretty racist undertone to how Indians looked and appraised our own selves. So if something was done or worn by the white guy, apparently it was superior because he was lording over us, right? So there's a lot of white supremacy sort of narrative that entered into Indian psyche at that point in time, unsurprisingly. The history of chai or tea is inextricably linked to British interest in this country. Very short, if I were to just give you a summary, they turned us into a factory. China was the largest producer and exporter of tea because tea is native to that part of the world. And the British wanted a lot of tea. The British wanted a lot of tea because one of their queens who brought, she was a Spanish princess, Catherine, and Catherine brought in her dowry two things, maybe many things, but two things of note and repute that I mentioned. One, she brought a chest of tea, a pound of tea. And the second, she brought the island of Bombay. So that's how the British acquired Bombay from the Portuguese in Dahej. Dahej leke aayi thi wo. Chai bhi leke aayi thi Dahej mein. So when she brought tea, it was actually more expensive than the island of Bombay, that pound of tea. And this is public domain. You can actually look up. They actually show you in pound sterling that Bombay was cheaper than a pound of tea. So she made it really fashionable in the court and in British royalty to drink tea. And if the queen is drinking tea, then all the other noble ladies and aristocracy and all the other feudal lords and ladies, they wanted to have tea. So they started developing this custom and ritual of high tea, low tea, and it started influencing and informing your socioeconomic status in Victorian and medieval England. And because there was a lot of domestic demand, they had to satisfy the demand from somewhere. And the Chinese emperor was like, dudes, you want tea, you gotta pay taxes. The British didn't want to pay taxes. They said, actually we're gonna go in, we will smuggle some tea plants from your country. And we've identified places in South Asia, because Bharat to hamari jaagir hai. So we'll actually smuggle some of those tea plants and we will start experimenting with trying to grow them. And they found really good climate to grow them in the Western Ghats, the Nilgiri Hills. They also found really, really good landscape and weather to be able to grow it in Assam, in the northeastern part of our country. And that's when things changed. By 1888, India was the largest exporter of tea. All the best tea, all the different varieties of tea were exported, they were grown, they were cultivated in our country, and they were exported primarily to Great Britain, to Europe, and to the 13 American colonies, because they colonized the east coast of the United States. अगर इंडिया और चाइना की चाय नहीं होती, तो आज United States of America नहीं होता, वो Great Britain होता. Because the American Revolution happened primarily because the Boston Tea Party, right? So this tea plant was smuggled. When I talk about coffee, chicory was not even cultivated in India. It was actually grown in France. And after 1950s is when they started to grow it, locally, and started blending it and so on. So again, kind of an influence of the British. The coffee estates became really big. They became very commercialized during the British times. The tea estates definitely So tea has a greater linkage. When we think of tea, we also think of an intensively monocropped system, which is thirsty. Tea needs water. Does not need standing water like paddy cultivation, needs water to just flow, but it needs water. So it impacted the biodiversity of the Western Ghats that are the lungs of South Asia. They're the lungs of the Indian subcontinent. And when you grow only one thing and it's a cash crop and it's meant for export, it's not meant for us. Opium was grown for export to China. Afeem koi kha to nahi sakta na. I cannot invite you to my house and say, अफीम की भाजी बनाई है, चाय भी देंगे साथ में, खा लेना. I'm not, and ghee भी डाल देंगे बीच में, just so I'm pretty rich, I can offer you ghee and afeem, right? So we were reduced to growing cash crops, which were meant to placate the material and trading interests of the East India Company and later on the Crown. The second thing that the British did, and British, China is a functional tea market. Very medicinal teas, and they don't add milk to their teas and sugar to their teas. But the British do. So they needed two other components, namely refined white sugar, and they needed cow's milk. So the first ever dairy farms were actually established in India by the British in the early 1900s. They did a livestock census for the first time in around 1894. And they decreed कि हमने सर्वे कर लिया है, इंडियंस की तरह इनकी जो काउ भी है वो यूजलेस है, कुछ प्रोड्यूस नहीं करती. So now an imperial dairy expert had to be nominated and some major dairy development training center had to be created in the early 1920s so that scientific management of dairy farms could be done, because Indians are pretty useless, they can't do anything by themselves. And their cows are just as useless as they are. So that is when the first European breeds were brought in the name of science. So I've gone through these slides. They developed the tea habit, they expanded their global empire, all to break China's monopoly. And by 1888, they had turned us into a tea factory. They also turned us into a coffee factory. So monsoon Malabar filter coffee with chicory, sugar and dairy milk. All of that is a pretty colonial recipe. It is not a native South Asian recipe. And the Royal Geographical Society, that was pretty interesting. There were some people who had some conscience. And they started writing as early as 1866 about the widespread surface soil damage in the Western Ghats because of the coffee and the tea plantations. And they started warning about floods, uncontrollable floods that might occur should a really heavy monsoon were to happen. Obviously, when we think about plantation, we think about plantation labor. A lot of people, I don't know if did you see that movie where Leonardo DiCaprio, it was called Blood Diamond, right? And they speak about how in African mines, especially in South African mines, really little children, women, people who are handicapped or whatever, they are forced without pay to mine diamonds. I personally believe, and I have a great deal of sympathy for all the diamond mine workers, but I have a lot of sympathy for plantation labor in coffee and tea estates, spice plantations, cashew plantations in our country. We don't talk about it often enough. So the next time you opt for a cup of chai or a cup of coffee, if there's anything that you remember from this session, I really want you to think about the blood in that chai and the blood in that coffee, because there was a lot of upheaval. And when you look at some of that plantation labor, predominantly women. They were forced, a lot of lower caste South Asian women, especially from the southern part of our country, were put on trains and they were sent to the Assam and the northeastern states to go and work as indentured labor. So you can imagine, you show up you don't speak the language, because this country is not just one country, I mean, we have multiple countries in one country. You show up, you're someone who has lower self-esteem anyway because you're treated a certain way as a lower caste person, and you're thrown into a tea estate to start working as plantation labor. There's a lot and lot of really bloody history behind plantation. So it's really important to understand how and where our tea leaves and our coffee is being sourced from. And I'm not advocating for give up these beverages. I'm saying portion control, that's important. But when you do choose to drink it, drink mindfully. Think about where it comes from. And if there is a responsible way of consuming any of these beverages, think about it. Sugar, once again, they sidelined jaggery. There were laws that were created. Sugar mills were set up. So pretty simple. You get the template, right? It's a trading sort of a template. It has nothing to do with I'm going to come and get genetically and culturally absorbed into your country. I'm basically going to treat you like a manufacturing facility. I'm going to grow things. I'm going to cultivate things. I'm going to process things. I'll set up the railway system from the textile factories to the coast, from the sugar mills to the coast, from the tea estates to the coast. So when people talk about hame railways to de gaye na British log, when they say that, I cringe. Thanks. It's called Stockholm syndrome. It's a well-established syndrome, or a disorder that is spoken of in psychotherapy circles, where people who take you hostage for a long time, the person who has been kidnapped actually starts developing empathy and sympathy for the person who kidnapped them, for the kidnapper. It's a real thing. It's a psychological disorder that happens, and I feel that sometimes South Asia suffers from that psychological Stockholm syndrome en masse, because we say, अंग्रेज नहीं होते ना तो हमने ये नहीं करना था, अगर अंग्रेज नहीं होते तो हमारा railways नहीं बनना था, as if, I'm pretty sure we would have been totally fine, but it's a conjecture. I cannot change history, none of you can. So what's wrong with the cup of chai or coffee? When we think of tea and coffee, again, Achyutan is the right person to inform you more about the clinical aspects of it. I'll just briefly mention here. They're really addictive. They're physiochemically addictive. Coffee, especially, it can actually lead to hyperventilation. It can increase your resting heart rate by a lot. I don't want to break your mic. But anyway, so when you look at tea, it has tannins in it. So if you're having something along with your tea and you're saying, I'm having a really nutritious breakfast, that tea is preventing the nutrients in the food that you're eating from being absorbed into your bloodstream. So it's counteracting. When you look at sugar, there are lots and lots of research that's done. A lot of people, that Achyutan works with, and they talk about how chronically addicted they are to sugar. Sugar addiction is really, really difficult to get rid of. And in research, it's been found to be more addictive than cocaine. It's a legal drug. Now think about it. If we lived in a world where cocaine, we do live in a world, cocaine is banned substance, right? Like if I was to carry cocaine, United Airlines will boot me, and government of India will not be my friend. But if we lived in a world where people understood that sugar is more addictive than cocaine, then storing sugar in our homes would be illegal, right? It would be an offense. But it's not. We actually give it to our kids. We put it in chocolate, and we feed ourselves and our families with it. We entertain with it. We feast and party with it. Dairy is pretty interesting. How many people here, because I don't want to sort of spend more time, there is a couple of other stuff, a couple of other slides that I really want to talk about. How many of you consume some amount of dairy at this point in time? Does someone do? A little bit? You do? Yeah. So dairy is also physiologically pretty addictive. The reason why it's addictive is डेयरी का मकसद क्या है, उसका ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है? The cow milk, when the cow is pregnant and she gives birth to the calf is supposed to drink that, and in a very short period of time, over just a matter of few months, that calf's, the role of the dairy milk is to, amplify, for lack of a better word, a calf into a full-grown cow or an ox. How does it do it? Is because dairy milk contains IGF. It's called insulin-like growth factor. This IGF, when the calf ingests it, it leads its cells to multiply at a furious, rapid rate. It's multiplying really fast, really fast, really fast. Now, when we, as humans, especially adult humans, when we have a substance like dairy that has insulin-like growth factor in it, then it leads to blind replication of cells in us as well. When that happens, we call it microtumor growth, which is cancer. So there are lots and lots of studies at this point which have demonstrated that ingestion of bovine dairy is implicated in nurturing and offering nutrition to microtumor environments in our human body. It has saturated fat. It has estrogen. Just the other day I was talking to a woman and she has PCOS. And my own ovaries were scarred in 2015. Within 6 months, all the scarring went away. I don't have PCOS anymore. But it's a really painful disease to have, and it leads to a lot of fertility issues and so on. Human females produce our own estrogen. We don't need cow estrogen inside our body because the human body doesn't recognize and doesn't know what to do with the cow estrogen. When human males consume dairy, they're actually imbibing a lot of female hormones, female bovine hormones. And that in some obese males might show up in the form of male boobs. I don't know, man boobs. Have you heard of that term? Where some guys tend to develop, post-puberty sexual characteristics of females. And that tends to happen because they're literally drinking cow estrogen. There's bovine hormones, and there's a lot of testing that happens on samples of milk. A cup of milk apparently contains 2 tablespoonfuls of pus cells. It's very difficult to, extricate it or separate it. So it does. I frequently call it cow pus. So anyway, say wo dala hai, so now it's become Ayurvedic. There's nothing Ayurvedic about either chai or coffee. It's marketing at best, colonial marketing. Well, 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater. You guys have had a narrow escape with water, some not so much. I hear that a really popular cricketer needs, 20 crore rupees to be able to perform repairs in his house, which tells me that he has 20 crore rupees in the first place, which is quite insightful. So how is climate change linked to what we eat, and specifically with cow? So India has, unfortunately, we've become the hosts of 40% of the world's cow population. बहुत cow है यहाँ पे, बहुत ज़्यादा cow घूमती फिरती रहती है. And what happens is that cows, when they fart and when they belch, they produce methane. And they also produce nitrous oxide, not nitric oxide, nitrous oxide. And these are silent cousins of carbon dioxide. When we think of fossil fuel emissions, when we think of climate change, we think about carbon dioxide. That's what we're taught. That's what the media would have us believe. The reality is, wherever there is animal agriculture, you have a living, breathing organism that we have played God with because we have genetically altered that organism. Right now, desi cows don't tend to exist. They're a mixture of Bos taurus and Bos indicus. And when you look at what they're emitting, there's a couple of things that's going on, in this Indian subcontinent at this point in time. You've got all these cows, and they're emitting extremely lethal and noxious greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane. On the other hand, because of colonialism, we got rid of most of our lungs. We've disrupted the biodiversity in the Himalayas, we've disrupted the biodiversity in the Western Ghats. And when we look at the Indian Ocean, one of the largest ocean dead zones is actually in the Indian Ocean. So more than the forests, the ocean is the one that captures carbon and fixes it and removes it from the atmosphere. We have neither. So we are handicapped. And on top of it, in the name of hum to chai roz piyenge, coffee roz piyenge, hum kheer khayenge, paisam khayenge, all of those behaviors, and butter chicken obviously, and khichdi with ghee, we are hosting climate change. When we look at dairy, I encourage you to think of dairy equals beef equals leather. So all the smug vegetarianism that we see in the media and in our homes and in our extended families that say, hum beef to nahi khate ji, na, hamara dharm brasht ho jayega. You know, what do you think happens to all those cows that give milk, and once they've stopped giving milk, where do they go? Nahi, gaushala banayi na Modi ji ne, to ab banaiye, Modi ji ab aaye hain. What happens to the buffaloes? Most of the milk that is produced and consumed in this country are water buffaloes. We are the largest exporter of beef, Cara beef. It's ridiculous. We're the largest, we own 13% of the global leather industry. So this trifecta, when you think of beef, when you think of leather, when you think of dairy, is one and the same thing. This is pretty interesting. These are some of the last slides that I have, you know, before we can get on with a conversation, because I'd love to hear what you guys think so far. So we've seen that there is a redesign of our cuisine. There's a redesign of what we grew, how we used our land by the British. And there's an impact of it on us, you know, on Indians in general, South Asians in general, and also people of Karnataka. So let's think about that. And what are the epigenetic consequences of it? And how have these narratives fueled post-colonial policy? So when we talk about our inheritance, you know, we say Indian Railways is like this big thing, so that's our legacy that we've inherited. We've inherited dairy industry, we've inherited leather, coffee, tea. Because we have Stockholm Syndrome, we're incredibly proud of all of these things. So post-colonial policy in terms of food, nutrition, and agriculture reflects that obsession that we have with some of these industries. But before we go there, let's think about epigenetic consequences. Has everyone here heard about the Holocaust during the Second World War? So I'm referring to what Adolf Hitler and his people did to the Jewish community. It was incredibly unfortunate. When we look at famines in India from around 1879 to 1944, there were 12 famines in India that are documented. And when you think of the scale of famines, they are from mild famine, moderate famine, the worst being catastrophic famine. Most of these 12 famines were rated on the Richter scale, if you like, of famines. They were rated as catastrophic famines. When you actually add up कि कितने लोग मरे or impact हुए, what was the impact on humanity in India at that point in time? The total number, which you don't see here, was 97 million people. 97 million people. When we look at the Great Famine, which actually impacted these photos that you see here are from Karnataka. This is Bangalore, 1878. So this slide, I actually showed just the 1876 to 1878, the 2 years Great Famine. This is how Bangaloreans looked like back in the day. It was an intense drought situation that impacted the Deccan Plateau. It led to crop failure. And you're not growing vegetables anymore. You're not growing the wild rice varieties anymore. You're actually indentured labor, and you're growing coffee for someone, tea for someone, you know, cultivating sugarcane for someone, and so on. Those are cash crops. During that time, these famines, so a drought shouldn't lead to famine necessarily. But these were policy designed famines because grain was continued to be exported by the British at record numbers, even while Indians, and in this specific case, people of Karnataka, were dying in unprecedented numbers. And they were growing cash crops, so you know, whatever you were growing, you weren't able to eat it. There was no famine relief that was offered by the colonial government. They basically said that the Kolar to Bangalore railway line was under construction at that point in time. If you come forward and if you work, maybe we will give you a reduced wage. So if you're a man, you might get 450 grams of grain and 1 anna, which was the currency during British Indian times. And if you're a woman or a working child, you will get even reduced amount of grain and money. So what it did was, it actually developed a third world country, third class country kind of a colonial narrative about India. Because all these illustrations that you see, there's one photograph but the other two are illustrations. These illustrations were in the Illustrated London News. This is media, guys, all right? This is ZTV of the times, right? NDTV of the time. So in Great Britain, what people are seeing of India are all these people with haddiyan bahar, right? So it starts to develop a really popular perception of Indians as ये तो भूखे नंगे ऐसे टाइप के लोग होते हैं, थर्ड वर्ल्ड कंट्री है ये. There was no increase in per capita income during the 200 years of British rule in this country. The average life expectancy actually dropped by a fifth. So we lost our life expectancy. We were malnourished to the point of deprivation. And it actually sowed the seeds of India deficient hai. India के पास protein नहीं है. India के लोग भूखे नंगे हैं. So how do you remedy that? You remedy that by offering protein alternatives. But ये लोग beef तो खाते नहीं हैं, vegetarian है, इनको क्या पिलाएं हम? दूध पिलाते हैं. So it's an acceptable solution. Let's give more milk. So the European Economic Community, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, a lot of them so post-independent India in the 1950s, they actually gave a lot of stimulus. They gave a lot of loans to India to develop the dairy industry even further than what the British had. Why? Because India was deficient. We needed protein, apparently. So these are the 12. Again, this is a photograph. This is a photograph from Bangalore, the IT hub of the East. This is what Bangalore looked like. People. A large number of agricultural workers, laborers, handloom weavers. Now, when you look at handloom weavers, handicraft artisans, they are the custodians of culture in any country, in any region of the world. They didn't have anything. So what the British did, यहाँ पे कुछ नहीं है करने को, आपको हम कैरिबियन में भेज देते हैं, वेस्ट इंडीज़ में चले जाओ, वहाँ पे शुगर केन की खेती करो. So that's how a lot of people of Indian ancestry, they ended up in South Africa, they ended up in Fiji, they ended up in the Caribbean islands, tropical colonies of the Britain. So how does one actually go from here to there. Now, this situation happened in this country for 223 years, 1779 to 1879, no, what am I saying? 1779 to 1944. So you have 223 years of people looking like this every other year or 2 years because famine ho raha hai. And then you achieve so-called independence. We have sovereignty of our own, and we go from this to that. हमें तो मोटे कैसे हो गए? Diabetic कैसे हो गए? Heart disease क्यों हो गया हमें? And it's not that सिर्फ इंडिया में हुए. When you look at the United States, when you look at Europe, the obesity epidemic is everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's everywhere. However, when you look at the fair share of the Indian population on the planet, so we're 25% of the world's population at this point in time. However, we are 60% of the world's heart disease population. So we over-index. हमारी batting average बहुत ज़्यादा है when it comes to heart disease and diabetes. So when we look at this, why did it happen? And it's pretty interesting. I could not find even a single study or a single research paper, no matter where I looked. No epigenetic study on what's the impact on the DNA of modern Indians of the famines that happened in India for 223 years. Couldn't find a single research. If any of you is able to find it, please, let me know. I'm open to influence. So what I'm going to do here is look at a reference study. This was basically a famine that ended about 70 years ago. India achieved its independence 75 years ago, right? So it's a good research to compare with. This was the Dutch famine when very briefly during the Second World War, there was a Nazi occupation of people in the Netherlands, and they didn't have much to eat. So a famine struck, and you see in the photograph on the top right that somebody's lying on the floor, on the ground, and so people were dying. And research actually shows that the Dutch hunger winter, as that famine was called, in subsequent generations, the Dutch had a higher risk of heart disease, up to 2 times greater risk, and they had higher rates of obesity throughout life and an increased risk of hypertension as an adult. When you look at some of the women who happened to be pregnant during the time of famine, the birth weight of babies, infants, when they were born was a lower birth weight because the mother's body was in such nutritional deprivation and stress. So there's no study to date on the research of the epigenetic impact of 223 years of catastrophic famine on the South Asian epigenome. तो जो हमारे genes हैं, उसके अंदर ये British colonially designed induced famine का जो circumstance था, वो हमारे genes में चला गया है, genetic expression में चला गया है. And on top of it, when you have KFC and McDonald's and दूध की नदियाँ बहा देंगे हम, dairy farm, all of that. When we adopt that sort of colonially inspired cuisine, we become the hotbed for what we are witnessing at this point in time in terms of chronic illness. And we have no research to show for it. I searched, you guys, I couldn't find it. So I have to bring here a European example. If any of you are nutritional epidemiologists or researchers, please take this up, and this is white space. This needs to be researched. So a theory has been proposed, and the theory is called the South Asian thrifty gene hypothesis. What it says is pretty simply, people whose ancestors have undergone such nutritional trauma, their epigenetics or their DNA now has a hoarding impact. कि जहाँ पे थोड़ा सा फैट भी मिल जाता है हम उसको होर्ड कर लेते हैं, जहाँ से थोड़ा सा भी कोलेस्ट्रॉल मिल जाता है हम उसे होर्ड कर लेते हैं. हाई एनर्जी लो माइक्रो न्यूट्रिएंट मील्स अगर मिल जाती हैं हम हमारी body hoard करना शुरू कर देती है. Hoarding, you understand? We start storing. When we store, we get truncal obesity, the high adiposity that you see in the truncal area, waist area. When you look at women, the distribution of fat is slightly different. So your upper arms, your thighs, your hip area. What is epigenetics? It's a study of how your behaviors and your environment can cause changes in the way how your genes work. So if a short period of time of famine in the Netherlands can lead to that, then it's a conjecture, a theory, a construct that I'm putting forward that 223 years of catastrophic famine must have had an impact on the Indian epigenome. All right, this is what happens. I hope you can see this, but very quickly. The maternal diet obviously suffers, right? And if you remember, the colonial relief scheme was if you're a man, you'll get more grain and you'll get paid 1 anna, which is practically nothing. If you're a woman, you will actually get less. So if you're a pregnant woman, you're useless to the colonizer because you can't work on the Kolar-Bangalore railway line, right? And then the maternal-paternal genetic background and other things like exposure to environmental factors. If you're working in a quarry, if you're working in a mine, if you're working as a plantation labor, women get pregnant, men don't get pregnant, right? So if women are the ones who are part of that plantation labor, agricultural, whatever, bottom of the totem pole when it comes to agricultural labor and exploited to the extent that they were by the colonizer, then we bear the offspring. Remember the ancestral meditation we did? Think about those ancestors or our great-great-grandparents from the 200-year band from that total of 400 years. If we imagine what they went through, they were basically walking around with their ribs showing. And if today we say, मैं तो थोड़ा सा खा लेता हूँ, मैं इतना मोटा हो जाता हूँ. When we say that कि थोड़ा का ये, if our batting average is so high, it's primarily because there are epigenetic changes empowered, and we've got to come forward and say, हमें अपने ऊपर research करनी है, right? So when you look at all of this, epigenetic modifications हो गया during the development of the fetus inside the mother's womb. You see obesity, you see metabolic syndrome, you see heart disease, you see low birth weight, developmental illness, mental illness, and you see diabetes. So colonial labeling and narratives, because we know the power of vocabulary, right? The power of vocabulary is, this is a third world country, it's a developing country. We actually self-label ourselves that way. So there's a lot of power in vocabulary. And then there's the white revolution, which is dairy, which is leather, which is beef. Then there's green revolution, intensive monocropping for export. Paddy cultivation, wheat cultivation. We forgot about millets that are drought resistant, by the way. So drought तो अगर हो भी गया था, great famine of 1878 to whatever, 76 to 78, अगर हम millets उगा रहे होते, तो वो drought resistant थी कि नहीं थी, खा लेते. But we were actually focusing on cash crops at that point in time. अफीम उगा रहे थे हम, Chinese emperor को देने के लिए. So then liberalization of the economy in 1991 opened the floodgates for a lot of American fast food companies to come in. So McDonald's Corporation, KFC, all of them. I'm a 90s kid. Yeah, I saw it happen. I remember that, you know, we went crazy when KFC opened in Chandigarh, and we all wanted to go and get some fried chicken. We are an epigenetic time bomb at this point in time. A big time bomb. Not just an epigenetic time bomb, we're also a climate change, burden of climate change time bomb. And what happened in Bangalore with things submerged and, you know, people getting electrocuted and whatever is a trailer. It's a very short trailer. What's happening in Pakistan, you've heard, right? 1/3 of the country is underwater. Think about pregnant women in Pakistan right now. What's happening and what's going to happen 2 generations later? They don't have food. They will never come out of it, literally. This is what's going on in that country. 900,000 animals lost, livestock. When wildfires happen or when floods happen, हम कहते हैं ना government ने evacuate करा दिया, right? That evacuation is meant for human beings. और basically हमारा Tommy, जिसको हम family member की तरह पालते हैं, dog, उसको evacuate करा लेते हैं. But we don't think about the cows and the buffaloes and sheep and goats. We don't count them. They're not even counted. That's how deep our speciesism goes. इस word को carnism भी कहते हैं. There's a Harvard sociologist, her name is Dr. Melanie Joy, and she's done a lot of work on carnism, and she actually effectively coined this term, carnism. So my food for thought and a request is, let's think about our speciesism, let's think about our carnism. This is pretty quick, I'm pretty sure you guys know. Operation Flood started in 1960s. 1965 is when the National Dairy Development Corporation was established. And Dr. Kurian, you know, I'm pretty sure he had all the noble intentions with whatever he understood at the time, but he created the Anand experiment, and then Amul and other, you know, dairy cooperatives were formed. Pretty interesting thing, you know, when you think about dairy in the United States or Europe, you think of large CAFOs. These are commercial agri-feeding operations, huge. They run like hectares and hectares of land. When we think of the Indian, South Asian, Pakistan included, Bangladesh included, when we look at the dairy sector in our subcontinent, we think of cooperative. We think of, you know, people who are subsistence dairy farmers. And that makes a really sexy story of poor Indians, poor Indian farmer. There are 4 Harvard Business School case studies. Recently I was presenting at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and I said, your business school about, you know, 2 feet away from here actually published 4 business cases glorifying the Indian dairy sector, and what a fantastic case study of welfare economics it is. India pulled it off. ना केवल हम self-reliant हो गए, हम dairy surplus हो गए, हमने Indian dairy farmers को भी रोजगार दिला दिया. Those farmers are in debt. A lot of, you know, farmers, people who grow crops for us. Sometimes they grow crops. They're also dairy farmers part-time. There's a lot of mental health epidemic amongst farmers at this point in time. You've heard about the farmer suicides, right? Farmer suicide rate in South Asia is amongst the largest in that intact community anywhere in the world. It's here in South Asia. These are deadly dairy facts, so I've actually shared all of these with you. In 1998, we actually became the largest producer and consumer of dairy in the world. I don't know if I'm proud of it. I'm really not. This is a side-by-side graph of where our milk production was, and at that point in time where the diabetic numbers were for our country. And it's a pretty conservative number. You know, diabetes is a chronic illness. When you say chronic illness, chronic means over a long period of time. Diabetes overnight nahi ho jati hai. So people go through metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, and then diabetes ka diagnosis aata hai because your HbA1c becomes higher than 5.6 or whatever. We don't have the right numbers for it, but you can see that there is a correlation. Now, persons born in the late 70s to 80s are the first ever generation of Indians to truly have experienced abundance of dairy. जो कहते हैं लॉर्ड कृष्णा दूध और मक्खन के उसमें नदी में तैरते थे कि यमुना नहीं थी, उसमें दूध था, या गंगा, whichever holy river you want to pick, या नर्मदा. No. I was born in 1980, towards the end of it, December 1980. How many of you were born in that time period that I mentioned? In and around that time period, or maybe even after? I see some young people here. उससे पहले या 70s 80s, right? Yeah. So उससे पहले there was very little. But you know what there was? Actual में dairy नहीं थी, aspiration थी कि होनी चाहिए. तो वो aspiration से ही तो abundance आती है ना, because we dream it, we manifest it. As a culture, we dreamt it, we manifested it. But whose dream did we manifest? Somebody else's. That's the point I'm trying to make. We manifested somebody else's dream. फिर हम कहते हैं हम तो गुलाम थे, हम आज़ाद हो गए. गुलामी तो हमारे प्लेट में है, बेड टी में है. बेबी बेड टी दे दो. Some of the men, I don't know, maybe some of the women also say, चाय तो आप ही बनाओगे आज. We have amazing media advertisements like floating around on our channels that talks about that moment of, you know, dairy consumption. Again, when we look at animal products, meat is on the menu. This is the map of India, and whatever is red, darker the red is, people identify as non-vegetarians. So it's on the rise, and I've already spoken about TMAO and the role of that metabolite in chronic illness. And affluence leads to greater consumption of animal foods, you know, because what do? I don't know if it happens in Karnataka or in Bangalore, but definitely happens in Ludhiana and Amritsar and in Chandigarh, you know, where say, उन्होंने क्या बनाया था, क्या खिलाया था, बेटी की शादी थी, खिलाया क्या था, ये बताओ. शाही पनीर था, बटर चिकन था, ले ये भी नहीं कर सके. फिर तो खाते पीते घर के नहीं हैं. You know, like I'm thinking I should do stand-up comedy on this circumstance. Literally, it will be viral. You know, if any one of you wants to help me in production of it, happy to write a script. Because this is exactly how we create reference benchmarks for having arrived on the planet. कितना दूध, कितना घी हम खा रहे हैं, chicken कितना खा रहे हैं. Epigenetics. Okay, this is me, by the way. So on the left is this woman who I'm told ये सबकी बड़ी बहन लगती है. मैं ही हूँ in 2014. And then on the right side is me, you know, once I went whole food, plant-based, oil-free. So what is this concept of biological and metabolic age? It's a pretty interesting concept. Basically says that your chronological age is however number of years you've been on the planet, right? But आपके cells की age क्या है? आपके metabolism की age क्या है? You know, that is your metabolic or your biological age. And now we have algorithmic, you know, platforms, epigenetic examination with DNA methylation को check करते हैं around 10,000 sites. They will say, you know, you are 42 years age, but in actuality, if, you know, your DNA shows that you are whatever age you might be. And when we look at mitochondrial dysfunction or DNA level पे methylation जो हो जाती है, that is very closely related to metabolic aging. So what can happen is that your metabolic age might actually be higher than your chronological age. What are the factors? Now these are 10 factors, and as I read out each of the factors, I highly encourage you, I invite each of you to think about your own self, okay? So number one, these are risk factors of maybe a low metabolic age. Consumption of animal products including dairy. Number two, prevalence of a clinical diagnosis of chronic illness. Prevalence of obesity. क्योंकि हमारी कंट्री में ओबेसिटी को chronic illness में नहीं गिना जाता. खाते पीते घर के हैं. It's a badge of honor that we carry, right? अगर पतले हैं तो I don't know आप कन्नड़ा में क्या बोलते हो, पंजाबी में बोलते हैं लिस्सा, माड़ा, ऐसे words बोलते हैं. You know, whenever I go back to my hometown, they'll say लिस्सी हो गई है, माड़ी हो गई है. Why? Because women who I went to high school with, they're like 3x my size. They're buying double XL, right? Go figure. Prevalence of mental health issues and high stress. Prevalence of compromised immune function. That's the other thing. हमारी तो immunity बहुत low हो गई है. Then family history of chronic illness and obesity. This is a pretty interesting one. This was 2009, no, 2010 or something. I was doing focus groups. You know, I was part of this consumer packaged goods industry, and as part of that, you do a lot of consumer research. So, वो consumer focus groups करते हैं. Here, everyone understand what a focus group is? So, group में लोगों को इकट्ठा करके उनसे question पूछते हैं कि अगर हम आपको ये beauty soap बेचेंगे, आपको लगता है कि glow आ गई आपके face पे, you know, फिर उसके basis पे वो Lux beauty brand एक ऐश्वर्या राय को hire करके हम एक advertising बनाएंगे. So, I was in Punjab, and this was in Ludhiana. You know, so when I used to professionally go and do some consumer research in my own hometown, it was like, oh wow, I don't know. So very popular brand of spa, skincare or whatever, and they do Botox injections and they do plastic surgery and stuff like that. People bring cash. These are women, okay, focus groups. They bring cash because they want to get Botox done. This is like rural Punjabi women with tons and tons of agriculture money, okay. And they sat down and, you know, the moderator, we have a script with some questions to ask, and one of the questions was, what about obesity, what about skin concerns? You know, when people have metabolic syndrome, the big impact is on hair, skin, nails. Nails become brittle, hair start falling, and your skin has acne flare-ups and hormonal acne and so on. So a lot of these women, obviously, cosmetic company, and, you know, they want to talk about it. And they sat down, and I was amazed at each of them saying, and I'll say something in Punjabi, maybe it makes sense, I'll translate it for you, but वो होता है मज़ा पंजाबी में आता है बोल के, which is, मेरी सास दे ता 5 stent पे हुए हैं, right? It means मेरी सास, my mother-in-law, has 5 stents in her heart. So the other one wants to beat her to that run rate, and she basically says, ले, मेरे father-in-law उन्हें देता 6 पे हुए हैं, triple bypass हो रखी है, right? So literally that entire 5-minute conversation was around what sounded apparently the access to medical care and the access to health care. There's some of these really filthy rich women who could afford to spend lakhs on a monthly basis on Botox procedures, and they were obese as hell, you know, and they were competing on how seniors in their families, the number of stents that they had in their hearts. So if there's family history of chronic illness and obesity, and then they'll say diabetes to hamari family mein hai. Thyroid to hamari family mein hai. Thyroid sabka hota hai, wo gland hai, wo sabka hota hai yahan. Thyroid dysfunction aapki family mein hai. And why? Because the disease runs in your family, because the diet runs in your family. It has little to do with the thyroid itself, and the poor organ is keeping pace. Sedentary lifestyle, poor quality of sleep, smoking, alcohol, substance abuse mein na, I would like to add chai and coffee. So people say, aaj to na 6 cup chai ke ho gaye, bahut busy the, you know, or when somebody comes to your office, and I'm guilty of this in my past. I remember I started shaking after a round of meetings when I had 9 coffees that day. 9 coffees, and I'm 5 feet and nothing, right? You give me coffee, I'm injecting substance abuse inside of me. You know, it's like I'm high, hopping on drugs. But I was working, and I couldn't step out to the cafeteria and get lunch. And I was just doing cookies and coffee. People were coming into my office, and we were doing meetings. But this is what's happening. This is the IT Silicon Valley of the East, right? What do you think happens in those high rises, where people are just working? There's a coffee culture, there's a chai culture that I think is part of substance abuse. And then 10, presence of ancestral colonial trauma. So when you think of each of you, when I think of myself, or when I'm talking in South Asia, when you see those famine-stricken bodies with ribs coming out, वो हमारे ancestors हैं. Don't kid yourself and don't fool yourself. वो ही हैं हमारे ancestors. If you're in Kolkata, Great Bengal famine happened over there. If you're from Madhya Pradesh, in Indore, there was a major, and Madhya Pradesh to Bhopal gas tragedy, right? Union Carbide, you all remember, maybe some of you do, 1980s, right? All of that. Dr. Maitri Shankar was talking about how some of her colleagues in North India talk about cancer trains that go to and fro where people have cancer. They're cancer hotspots. There is antibiotic resistance in our bodies. Why? Couple of things. Overprescription of steroid medication, overprescription of antibiotics. हमारे यहाँ पे जो केमिस्ट होते हैं वो डॉक्टरों की तरह बिहेव करते हैं. तो डॉक्सीसाइक्लिन का पत्ता दे दे. It's the same as Cadbury's की चॉकलेट दे दे. It's literally the same thing. There's very little regulation. You can get prescription drugs on the counter, OTC, in this country. But then we think हमने तो बहुत antibiotics खा लिए. नहीं. The main source of antibiotics in our body is actually the animal products, the animals who have fed those antibiotics, and they're in the supply chain of it, and the trace of those antibiotics are then coming into our body. So it's a double whammy. And then we say India is a young country. Chronologically, yes. Metabolically, no. A hard no. और उस पर रिसर्च होनी चाहिए, लेकिन कोई कर नहीं रहा है, क्योंकि हम दूध की नदियाँ बहाना चाहते हैं, right? The other day, I was googling this and they said that there's, I don't know the name of the brand, but they said white revolution in Karnataka, and one of the largest dairy plants in South India was inaugurated recently. क्योंकि यहाँ पे हम दूध की नदियाँ बहा देंगे. So we're not metabolically a young country. So this is one of my last slides. So when we think of food, when we think of Sampurna Ahar, right? When we think of Ahar and Sampurna Ahar, what's the true cost of it and what's the true definition of it? It must be species appropriate for humans, number one. Number two, it should be minimally processed, ideally. It must not be implicated in cancer, diabetes, or zoonotic illness. It must not be physiologically addictive. Or suicidal depression. It should not be related to slavery, indentured labor, and human exploitation. And lastly, it shouldn't have a deadly carbon impact. हम कहते हैं climate change. Let's be selfish. The earth has survived for billions of years without us, and it's perfectly capable of surviving without us even in the future. So हमारी species जो है ना, उसका survival peril में है. It's a question of survival of our own species. And one of the questions that I ask is, what if God came to dinner? You know, no matter what your faith is, no matter what you believe in, if you invited God for dinner, क्या दोगे? मटन तो प्याज़ा दोगे God को? कि बटर चिकन खा लो, I've arrived in life, God जी. You won't ना? उस वक्त हम सोचते हैं सात्विक आहार देंगे, संपूर्ण अच्युतन को हम फ़ोन करेंगे and he will deliver tiffin. Have that daily. Acknowledge the God inside of you. Acknowledge the divinity inside of you. And, you know, I don't have a slide on that and I just thought about it. Give me an estimate of the number of cells in the human body. Anyone? About 110 trillion cells हैं, some estimates by scientists, in the human body. The next question is, how many of those 110 trillion cells in the human body are actually human cells? हाँ जी?
There are an equal number of microbes in us. And the doctors will say.
Yeah. So what I read online was around 10% are human cells and the other 90% are microbiota. And these are छोटे-छोटे कीटाणु जो हम बोलते हैं हिंदी में, कीटाणु, microorganisms that are in our gut microbiome, skin microbiome, on inside our body, नाक में, कान में, आँख के अंदर, everywhere. हम तो हमारे नहीं हैं. You guys are microbial clouds sitting here, you know, watching me. I'm a microbial cloud right now of non-human origin and I'm talking to you. This is who we are. So what your ahar is not for you. Ye feed hai for that 90% of the microbiota, and those are of primitive, primordial origin. So when our texts, our traditional texts, when they talk about prana shakti inside of us, that prana shakti is primordial, pracheen hai, that's the word for it. It's primordial, it's really, really old. We've got to acknowledge that. Lord Krishna की एक story है जिसमें his mother was, she asked him to open the mouth. You remember that? And he opened the mouth. She thought that he had, consumed something he shouldn't have as an infant. And he opened and she saw the entire Brahmand in it, saw the entire universe in it. That's a symbolic story. Uska matlab hai koi. So the idea is we've got to reappraise the narratives that we've inherited. We've got to reappraise the ancient narratives that we've inherited and not let marketing get in the way of Gopal Dairy Corporation. That's not what Gopala stood for. Not the dairy corporation, please. And an ahimsa ghee and ahimsa milk. Hogwash, complete marketing, coming from a marketer. I'm telling you, हम लोगों का बहुत बेवकूफ़ बनाते हैं. मैंने 15 साल बेवकूफ़ बनाया लोगों का और अपना भी. This is the reality. So is cow a mere animal to Indians? No, it's not. गऊ हमारी माता है. नंदी बुल को हम यहीं पे नंदी हिल्स में जाके पूजा करते हैं. So then why is the Charnamrit, what's it called in Kannada? Abhishekam? What is it? Right? It's called in North India, I think it's called Charnamrit. उसमें सब डेयरी घुसा रखी है. क्यों? Can't Charnamrit or Abhishekam be made with non-violent, truly ahimsa ingredients? It can. Creative हो जाओ. हो जाएंगे तो बना लेंगे. We're very creative. जुगाड़ करते हैं ना. जुगाड़ is a word. Do you guys understand that as well? In North, they say Indians are very jugadu people. We can do the jugad. But first we've got to understand what is a cow. If cow is a mother, तो माँ के साथ हम business नहीं कर सकते. And I'll use a crass word, धंधा. फिर वो माँ नहीं है. So if we really believe that it's a maternal figure, it's a divine bovine for us, both the ox as well as the bull and the cow, we better start behaving because the clock is ticking. I think Dr. Sarish Rao was here and he speaks about how by 2026, calamitous consequences will happen. We're well on our way to there. Thank you for your patience and thank you for giving me your time.